Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Before we go too much further into this, one of the most common questions I get is why talk about dominance so much. And as I've said before, and I know this might induce some eye rolls, but I really do think that the dominance of Bitcoin is the key to unlocking the secrets of the cryptoverse. And if you use the Bitcoin dominance to understand, sort of what stage of the cycle we are in, I think it will help improve your Sharpe ratio, right? Your risk adjusted returns. And the reason I say that is because if you come to a point where you think that dominance of Bitcoin is going to go up drastically, then it's often a good idea, not financial advice, but just based on history, it's often a good idea to consolidate, your portfolio into Bitcoin, right? And that often happens during quantitative tightening periods and really high interest rates, right? So the further you are in the business cycle, late business cycle, that's when typically Bitcoin dominance can go on a major bull run. And by consolidating a crypto portfolio into mostly just Bitcoin before this Bitcoin dominance run occurs, then it helps to preserve the Satoshi value of your portfolio. I can't tell you how many prior cycles where I simply, went knee deep into so many altcoins, DCAing them down all the way from the peak, getting excited anytime they had a pump, and then looking back on it in terms of valuing my portfolio in Bitcoin and just seeing that my Satoshi valuation of my portfolio was just being constantly devalued month after month after month after month. And so this has happened previously. It happened. And I decided this cycle I was going to focus on a Bitcoin heavy portfolio throughout quantitative tightening and high interest rates. And then to pivot that after on the other side of monetary policy, right? When we go to looser monetary policy, sometime thereafter, it would become more prudent to, in my opinion, to be a bit more diversified. Now, I will say that, like always, whenever I talk about this, there are a lot of people that push back on this idea. And what they say, and it's valid criticism, and I've addressed it many times, what they say is that, well, had you bought this altcoin at the bottom, you would be up, a certain amount, right? And that has outperformed Bitcoin. And that may be true, right? That may be true. But unfortunately for me, I cannot time the bottom on altcoins. I can't. I don't pretend to. Second of all, a lot of people that do that strategy, while they may be up on their altcoin buys recently, there's probably a series of buys all the way down in 2022 that are still underwater, right? So, had you just stuck with Bitcoin, you would have been a lot better off under most circumstances. With that said, there are some altcoins that have outperformed Bitcoin, and I've experienced that myself. I mean, last cycle I was very much into talking about those specific altcoins that were outperforming Bitcoin. This cycle I've just decided to, not deal with that as much and to just focus on the general market trend of Bitcoin dominance higher. But as you've seen, even in a Bitcoin dominance rally, there are some altcoins that have outperformed Bitcoin. And there always are. They typically are newer altcoins that don't have the baggage from prior cycles, but occasionally there will be some altcoins from the prior cycle that outperform Bitcoin. And it could be for all sorts of reasons, but we've seen that many, many times as well. So again, when we talk about a Bitcoin dominance rally, while I know a lot of people, criticize me for talking so much about it, the whole idea is to manage your risk and to say, you know what, Bitcoin is the king of the asset class, and if the dominance of Bitcoin is going to go up, then I'm just going to stick with that, right? And so for full disclosure, what I did was I converted, essentially most all of my altcoins to Bitcoin back at the beginning of 2022. And I also converted my ETH to Bitcoin in May of 2022, just before it dropped, and then it went right back up, but it was around 0.075. So I think one of the reasons why it's important to share that is because as humans, I think we're biased, right? So like if my portfolio is Bitcoin heavy, then I'm going to look for reasons why Bitcoin dominance should go up. And sometimes, right, sometimes, and it's worked out really well so far, but at some point, that trend will likely change. And we're going to talk a lot about that in this video, because I do think we can see the end in sight for but it's still a little ways off, right? I still think the Bitcoin dominance rally will continue for at least a little bit longer. But we'll talk about, what to look for in terms of where it could actually finalize. So with Bitcoin dominance, and we'll of course talk about Bitcoin USD. It's impossible to really talk about Bitcoin dominance without talking about Bitcoin USD. The whole idea behind the dominance rally is that, and this is what I've said in every single video basically on Bitcoin dominance, is no matter the direction of Bitcoin, whether it goes up or down, the Bitcoin dominance should go up. And we can look at the chart and say that's pretty clearly happened. I mean, you can see that, at least including stable coins, the Bitcoin dominance rally started in September of 2022. And we know that Bitcoin went down. We had the FTX collapse, and then it entered into an uptrend back in, from the low in November, but really Bitcoin really started moving in January. And you can see that throughout the entire time, the Bitcoin dominance has been going higher. Now, throughout the entire dominance rally, there have been people that have come out at every single local top to say that that is the top, right? Every single one. And, you give it enough time and it just continues to climb, okay? And it can be hard because I know what a lot of people want to do is they want to just go YOLO into the altcoin market and hope that they can gain on Bitcoin, right? Because because altcoins, as they say, can give oversized returns. And altcoins can give oversized returns against Bitcoin. Collectively, not just a few, they can, but normally that phase occurs during looser monetary policy and quantitative easing, where the Fed is increasing the size of their balance sheet. So there's two distinct phases of the cycle for Bitcoin. And you have Bitcoin uptrend, you have Bitcoin uptrends where Bitcoin dominance is going up. You also have Bitcoin uptrends where Bitcoin dominance is going down. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But this has been a trend that we have seen by Bitcoin dominance since September of 2022. However, I personally have been bullish on dominance since May of 2021. That was when I sort of loosely started to think, all right, maybe it won't go too much lower. And then I really became bullish on it here in Q4 of 2021, because that is, we had sort of had our chance to see Bitcoin dominance go lower. It couldn't really accomplish it. And therefore I felt like it was time to turn the ship around with the dominance and for it to go back up. But you might point out that dominance still continued to go lower just slightly until September of 2022. A main counterpoint to that, as I've mentioned, but I will reiterate it here, a main counterpoint is that if you calculate out the dominance excluding stablecoins, right? So if you exclude stables, what you'll see is that dominance has actually been in an uptrend. The low was in May 2021. That was actually when the low occurred. So when you include the stablecoin market, the low for dominance did not occur until September of 2022. When you exclude stablecoins, which I think is relevant to do, I think it's a reasonable thing to do, considering that I'm using the dominance to understand all Bitcoin valuations, not really using it to understand what the market cap of the stablecoins are. So I think it's relevant to look at it like that and to say, look, the dominance bottomed in May of 2021. And if the high for dominance is not in, which I still think dominance could go higher. If it's not in, then that means that the bull run in dominance has been going for almost 3 years. This coming May, will in fact be 3 years. And there is a case to be made, and I'm not going to stand by this because it really is dependent on monetary policy. And I don't know if you guys are aware, but monetary policy and expectations for monetary policy continue to change. And you know, I feel like we have to be willing to pivot, no pun intended, right? To pivot when when Bitcoin dominance is no longer bullish, based on how monetary policy changes this year. And the reason I say that is because last cycle, and again, it's not like we have a ton of data points, but so far it has worked out to be bullish on the dominance, right? So far it's worked out. Whether this just ends up being a lower high or not remains to be seen. I think there's a case to be made that it'll be a higher high. We'll talk about that too. But we've come so far, and so we have to think about what would actually turn the Bitcoin dominance train around. Like, what would actually make it stop and make it so that the altcoins start to outperform? There's a really great metric. It's called the Altcoin Season Index. And what you'll see is there's a few times in history when altcoin season index really stays elevated in altcoin season. So the red shaded box, if this orange line is in the red shaded box, then it implies some form of alt season. If we're in the green box, then it implies some form of Bitcoin season. Now, alt season does not always mean that altcoins are going up the way that this is defined. Sometimes you could be in, say, in quote unquote alt season, like we were here when Bitcoin was going down. It was just that Bitcoin was going down more than the altcoins. Therefore, it appeared like we were in alt season on this chart, but really it was just Bitcoin was underperforming most everything else during that period. But what you'll notice is that there's a few times where we briefly go into alt season, making people think that alt season is about to occur, and then we get rejected from it immediately. Right? You can see it happen many, many times. We briefly go into that alt season window, and then it just gets taken right back away as Bitcoin takes the reins once again. But there are some times where you stay in alt season for a long period of time. 2021 was a good example. 2017 was a good example. Late 2017, early 2018 was another good example. This here, right? How many people came out the last couple of weeks saying it's time for altcoins to take over? And here we are, the alt season index, you can see it was rejected almost immediately. And why is that? Because liquidity is flowing back to Bitcoin. Now, we've talked about why liquidity would flow back to Bitcoin. It's because of several reasons, right? First of all, there's no reason to change the bias until, in my opinion, until we're on the other side of monetary policy, on the other side of a pivot. Last cycle, and again, I get it, it's only one data point. I'm not asking you to take it to the bank. It's worked out so far to use this data point as a guide. Doesn't mean that it's going to continue to work out forever, but just for reference, right? Interest rates, two things, right? Two separate things. Interest rates, last cycle, when they started to be lowered, that marked the top for Bitcoin dominance. In the QT phase of the business cycle, there was another top by dominance that occurred later on, but that was in the QE phase of the business cycle. And I'll try to distinguish these two as well. The QT phase of the business cycle, Bitcoin was going up in 2019, and it went up until 1 month before the first rate cut. 1 month. And you can see that dominance topped out here in September of 2019, which was about 2 months after the first rate cut. So the reason I point this out is because this was a guide last cycle into when it made sense from a risk-adjusted returns perspective to think, all right, maybe Bitcoin dominance will no longer go up when we get to looser monetary policy. And that's exactly what happened, right? Dominance topped out a couple of months after the first rate cut. But there might be a better way to view this, and this is by looking at total assets of the Federal Reserve. And in this case, if you extend the line down, you can see that perhaps it wasn't the lower interest rates that was what we needed to watch to time a top on Bitcoin dominance. But in fact, it was when the Fed started to expand their balance sheet. You can see pretty clearly the Fed started to expand their balance sheet in September of 2019, which is precisely where Bitcoin dominance topped. Precisely where it topped. Why did the Fed expand their balance sheet here? It's because the economy was starting to show signs of weakness, right? It was starting to show signs of weakness, and this was their way of being more accommodating to the economy. And because there was more liquidity, because we're increasing liquidity, riskier assets started to outperform. And the reason is because when you go back to lower rates and you get increased liquidity, all of those fringe companies, if you think about like the S&P 500, those companies finally got that sweet drug QE, right? Quantitative easing. They finally got that sweet drug. And the people that were really weary of going into those companies because they didn't know if they were going to survive the rate hiking cycle, they could say, all right, the rate hiking cycle is over. We're going back to looser monetary policy. It's time to invest in those companies that have still survived and have not gone bankrupt. Now, some people will choose to buy those companies before we get to looser monetary policy, and it can sometimes work out really, really great because you're buying it before you get to a lot of those more known variables and when they're actually going to occur. But the downside is what happens if you pick a company that goes bankrupt, right? I mean, we don't know how long the rate hiking cycle will last, and we also don't know that even when they go back to looser rates, we don't know if it's going to be sufficiently loose to actually have a meaningful impact on demand. You can take that same analogy and apply it to crypto and say, well, I mean, what altcoin is going to survive? Yes, there's going to be a lot that survive. There's going to be a lot that don't. Bitcoin will probably survive, right? I mean, that's what that's what I feel like I can count on, is that from one cycle to another, Bitcoin will likely survive. I can't really say the same definitively about any other cryptocurrency. I mean, I could probably say the same about Ethereum, but it's just the case is not as strong for other cryptocurrencies. So when you're in a rate hiking cycle, late cycle, if it's early cycle and the Fed's not so aggressive, then altcoins can still do okay. But if it's an aggressive rate hiking cycle and it's late business cycle with a Fed reducing the size of their balance sheet, then it makes sense, in my opinion, to be Bitcoin heavy. Now, if you're just now watching this video for the first time, you're like, oh, well, maybe I should go convert my alts to Bitcoin. Guys, this has been a strategy, that I've been talking about for well over 2 years now, right? It's pretty late at this point to then jump into the jump on the bandwagon and say, all right, yeah, let's take this Bitcoin dominance party even higher. I do think dominance will go up, but again, it's pretty late at this point. If you haven't, if you didn't get on the Bitcoin dominance sort of bandwagon a while back, then at this point, it might just be a better learning experience over anything else. Because first of all, there's no guarantee that I'm right about it continuing to go higher. There's no guarantee. As much as I'd like to think it will, I could be wrong. And then second of all, even if it does go higher, there's no guarantee that the altcoin that you might convert to Bitcoin is actually one of the main ones that bleeds, right? It could be one of the few that outperform, and therefore you could feel upset about that if you sold your one altcoin that then outperformed Bitcoin. So I do want to just reiterate that that caveat of it. But the reason why we should talk about the balance sheet of the Fed and lower rates is because we're likely going to see those two things sometime soon. It's hard to, and by soon, I mean sometime in 2024. Like, I don't know when it's going to be. Right now, the first rate cut is not predicted by the markets to occur until May 1st, really. So it's really beginning of May. And in the last speech by Powell at the FOMC, he said that at the March meeting, they're going to start talking about balance sheet issues, right? So it's on their radar. And what's interesting is if you look at how much they reduced the balance sheet in the 2019 cycle, if you look to see how much they reduced the balance sheet over here, it was about, actually I need to pull it up on a, so if we look at how much they reduced the balance sheet back in this QT phase, it was about 16%. And right now they're at about 15%. So, you know, maybe they only take it down to about 16% to approximately 7.5 trillion. I don't know, plus or minus a few hundred billion. What's a few hundred billion among friends? Right? I don't know exactly where it's going to stop, but the point is that they're not going to do it forever, right? Like they're likely not going to get it anywhere close to where it was back over here, especially if in the last FOMC, Powell's already bringing up, they're going to start talking about it, right? So what if, again, just what if, like last cycle, where they stop reducing the size of their balance sheet, what if that marks the top for Bitcoin dominance? What if, right? And he said they're going to start talking about it at the March meeting. Maybe they don't stop it at the March meeting. Maybe they do it at the May meeting or the June meeting. I don't know. But he has alluded to the idea that there could be a case to be made at some point. They could cut rates, but not reduce, still not increase the size of their balance sheet. I don't know if that's going to happen. If that happens, that could throw a wrench into exactly where the dominance would actually top out. But if it happens like last cycle, where lower rates also correspond to the time that the Fed's increasing the size of their balance sheet, then I would very much say like that would be a candidate for a Bitcoin dominance top. And again, like, you know, I've been all accused of all sorts of things, like being a Bitcoin maxi, all this other stuff, just because I've been bullish on the Bitcoin dominance. But, you know, who can look at the Bitcoin dominance chart and say that it has been anything but an uptrend? I mean, it's been an uptrend for a long time. If you look at monthly Fibonacci candles, it literally has not had a red candle since November of 2022. I mean, it actually has been more bullish than Bitcoin USD in that regard, because Bitcoin USD did have 2 months of red candles. Bitcoin dominance has just been green the entire time, and it came close to going red when you look at the Fibonacci candles, but it still didn't. Bitcoin dominance has been extremely bullish for a long time. Obviously, Bitcoin has also been going up, in line with the idea, though, that Bitcoin dominance will go up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, right? No matter the direction implies that it could go up for Bitcoin to go up. And in fact, when Bitcoin goes up, that is the main way that Bitcoin breaks Bitcoin pairs down. I think that that's ultimately the end game here. I think that's what has to happen. Because if you look at ETH Bitcoin, right? You know, if you go look at ETH Bitcoin, it's been a pretty clear trend. A pretty clear trend in the past. We've seen 2 examples of it, and my guess is this time will not be different. That's my guess. Where you have a low that's put in. You have a low that's put in. First, you get your first peak, and then your second peak. Same thing here. First, second, first, and second. Between these 2 peaks, you form some type of a low. Some form of a low, and then a low here. And then from that low, you bounce around, right? You bounce around for a while. You go put in your second top, and you come back down, and then you retest that low, right? You retest that low, just like we did here and here. We got pretty close, and just like we did right here. But eventually, Bitcoin continues to basically, you know, it gets these rallies and then fades back down. It gets another rally, it fades back down, and it chops the altcoin market up. And then eventually, ETH Bitcoin finally throws in the towel, and it falls below that, you know, the sort of that intermediate low. And you can see, in fact, that in this cycle, ETH Bitcoin fell after it broke down. It fell about 50%. This cycle here, when ETH Bitcoin broke, it fell about 30%, right? So I don't know how far it's going to fall. I've suggested the 0.03 to 0.04 range as a potential target. But let's say it fell 10%. that would put it at 0.045. If it fell 20% from that level, it'd put it at 0.04. A 25% drop would put it at 0.0375. 30% drop would put it at 0.035. So, I mean, you can see the trend. And in every single case here, right, in every case, if you were to overlay Bitcoin onto the chart, it was, in fact, a Bitcoin rally in this case here, in this case here, and potentially in this case here, where ETH Bitcoin actually broke down, right? It was right here, right? It was a Bitcoin rally that broke ETH Bitcoin down here, a Bitcoin rally that broke ETH Bitcoin down. My guess is that you could get a rally that breaks ETH Bitcoin off of support. And I think that's what ultimately needs to happen. One of the things I think about crypto is it really does give us insight into the liquidity sloshing around. And perhaps we could think about this in terms of where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. That's sort of effectively, the consumer throwing in the towel and sort of giving up and wondering why their altcoins cannot go up against Bitcoin, and why Bitcoin, which many people, when they join crypto, they join it at tops where they don't really see Bitcoin do anything. All they see are altcoins do well. It's exactly the same thing as last cycle. I mean, if you think back to last cycle, everyone joined up here in 2017. And then in 2019, when Bitcoin went on this rally and the dominance went from 40% all the way up to, from 40% over here all the way up to over 70%, no one could really believe it. No one could really believe that the dominance went all the way back to 70%. Because when they joined crypto at the peak, all they ever saw Bitcoin do was go down. And all they saw initially was altcoins go up before they collapse. And so they just keep throwing money at these altcoins, hoping that they'll give them a return on their Satoshi value, and they just never do. At least not in any durable fashion. Again, if you can time the bottom, then I tip my hat to you. I can't do that. I can't time, altcoin bottoms, and especially not on their USD valuations. And that's what happened, right? I mean, Bitcoin went on this crazy rally, dominance went up a ton, and people threw in the towel and were like, well, hell, what's it going to take? What did it take? It took looser monetary policy to see the Bitcoin dominance finally top out. And again, it was a Bitcoin rally that broke ETH Bitcoin down in these prior examples. It was a Bitcoin rally. And if you look at ETH Bitcoin, I mean, it's at 0.053. I did a video on ETH Bitcoin about a month or so ago. And one of the things I mentioned was that if we don't get a weekly close below 0.049, the further we get into January, there's a chance that ETH Bitcoin gets a bounce. And the reason we say that is because that a lot of times ETH Bitcoin can get some form of a bounce in January. It actually happens quite a lot. If you're familiar with sort of seasonality with Ethereum, it doesn't happen every single year, but a lot of times there will be some form of a bounce. And also, historically, when you do get back down to the range lows, after that, after getting that bounce, you will get another bounce, right? You had this cycle over here, you had one big bounce up and then down. This cycle here, you had a bounce there, and then you got another bounce, and then it eventually faded. So we had this bounce, and I mean, it wasn't impossible to see it potentially coming if we couldn't get a weekly close below 0.049. But the problem is that, when ETH gets this bounces against Bitcoin, it's like the elevator up and the stairs down. So it's sort of just draining on a lot of people, because I think a lot of people, people either share the view, or they think the view is wrong, or they just don't care. I feel like a lot of people fall into they just don't care category. But the point is if you agree with the idea of ETH eventually breaking down against Bitcoin, it's sort of mentally taxing, because it's like, all right, you get this bounce, and then based on all this historical data that, all right, now you got to wait another month or two just for it to get another shot at breaking down, right? I mean, this is what happened, right? If it gets these big bounces, it's not like it just immediately goes down. I mean, this bounce occurred here the week of January 8th, and it's now February 8th, right? It's been a month already. And when we got this bounce, we talked about, hey, guys, it's probably going to be a while. It's going to take several weeks, at the very least, for ETH Bitcoin to get back down to the range low, and it's probably going to require Bitcoin to go, to work it, to sort of work it out, right? Go up, go down, chop the altcoin market up. You can also visualize this by looking at all Bitcoin pairs, right? So this here is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. And I think it's a great chart at better understanding altcoin bubbles against Bitcoin, right? If you just sort of look at the range low and then look at these highs, you can pretty clearly see bubbles, right? I mean, you can clearly see this was an altcoin bubble against Bitcoin. It went straight up, and then it took a long time to fade back down, right? And what's funny is that this move back to the upside didn't even occur until mid post halving year. I mean, it literally not for another 15 months compared to now. I mean, from this peak, altcoins bled against Bitcoin collectively for about 157 weeks. If you take it from this September high here, it's been about 125 weeks. And if you take it from this peak, sort of the final top in January, similar as this one, it's only been 108 weeks. So in my mind, as an investor, if you want exposure to crypto, that's why I've said for 2 years now, I think Bitcoin's where you want to be, because it gives you exposure to the upside, but it also minimizes your downside risk, right? I mean, we're all investors here. We understand there's risks both ways. I mean, we know that, Bitcoin could go up, and if it goes up, it's nice to have exposure to an asset that's appreciating. We know that Bitcoin can go down. I mean, it's not like we're immune to that idea. We've seen it happen many times. We talk about the downside risk a lot so that we're aware of what it is. But again, the issue is that if Bitcoin goes up, all Bitcoin pairs likely break down. If Bitcoin goes down, all USD pairs likely go down, right? So and if you think the Bitcoin dominance rally is going to be this thing that just goes on until we get back to loose monetary policy, then the way you preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio is to just mostly be in Bitcoin. Now, I know everyone's going to say, well, what about X altcoin or Y altcoin? Hey, more power to you. If you're making money in the altcoin market, I'm not here to discourage you. I'm just saying, hey, if we look back at this cycle in a few years and just see that the altcoin market eventually, did what it did last cycle and it eventually breaks down, it's not like fading the dominance rally was a smart move, right? I mean, you could have preserved the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio better just by being in a Bitcoin heavy portfolio. Now, let's look closely at what altcoins are doing against Bitcoin. If you look, I'm sort of making the case that we're emulating this part of the cycle, right? Where we came into a low here, and then we bounced off of it right there, and then we eventually broke down in July. Now, remember, July is an important month. Not because that's where the Fed started to expand their balance sheet, because they were not expanding their balance sheet then. Remember, they didn't start that until September. That's where altcoins bottomed against Bitcoin, right here, where the Fed started to expand their balance sheet. If you're not familiar, if you forgot what I mean, it's this line right here, the purple line. So right here is where the Fed, let me change it to a different color so we can see it. That's where alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed. Alt Bitcoin pairs finally broke down in June, 1 month before the first rate cut. 1 month. First rate cut was in July. Alt Bitcoin pairs broke down in June, the last week of June of 2019. So I think it makes sense to say that this phase right here is similar to this phase right here, where we come in and we set a low at around 40%. This was 43%. Over here, it was about 40%. And we bounce off of that low for a while. And then eventually, at some point, it finally gives. And you can even see how closely, how similar it is, right? You put in a low, and then you even go below that low, right? You have a wick slightly below that initial low. Same thing, right? A low, and then you have a wick slightly below that initial low, and then you get a bounce back to the upside. This bounce took you all the way up to about 53%. This bounce here took you about to 51%. And then, is it just going to fade back down? And again, the question is, if it does fade back down, does it end up breaking that low, right? Or sorry, this one here. Does it end up going below this? What you would look for is a weekly close. In the same way that when we talk about the ETH Bitcoin pair, you look for a weekly close below 0.049. For this metric, for total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you look for a weekly close below 0.39, or sorry, below 0.4. If it's 0.39, a weekly close at 0.39 or lower, then it means that Bitcoin has finally broken altcoins off of their Bitcoin support level collectively. As long as it's above 0.39, then Bitcoin still has work to do. And if we get back to looser monetary policy and it still hasn't broken down, then I might be willing to pivot my stance. But until that actually happens, I don't see any point in changing, sort of my bias on it. One thing to consider, and this is not a popular thing, but I have to mention it, is that a lot of altcoins do just bleed against Bitcoin over a long enough time period, right? If you were to go look at any altcoin that's been around for, 2 or 3 cycles, most of them, not all, there's a few that are not, but most of them become bleeders against Bitcoin eventually. Maybe not the first cycle, sometimes maybe not even the second cycle, but eventually they end up becoming a bleeder against Bitcoin. And you can kind of see it. Even in the altcoin chart, if you were to draw a parallel channel, right, from here to here, you can kind of see it. Look at it like this. You have a high, and these are lower highs. You have a low. This is a lower low. So if most individual altcoins bleed against Bitcoin over a long enough time period, you could make the case that the collective altcoin market bleeds against Bitcoin over a long enough time period. I don't know. I don't know how compelled I am to really go with that, because you could also easily make the case that altcoins are an oscillator against Bitcoin, with a low there and a low there and a low there. And this is this deviation that you shouldn't be too concerned about. Just like perhaps this was a deviation that we shouldn't be too concerned about. So I'm going into this with an open mind. Well, that might be somewhat comical, right? I'm going into it with the idea that alt Bitcoin pairs break down to 25%, right? From 44, I just went to 44, 45, 44. I'm going into it thinking they're going to break down from 45% down to 25%. From that level, I don't really care if they go a little bit lower. Maybe they go to 20%, maybe not. But when you get down to these levels, they're getting to be more attractive with respect to Bitcoin. Now, that doesn't mean they can't go down against the US dollar, but it could mean that they finally have stopped bleeding against Bitcoin. The telltale sign would be that if Bitcoin goes down for a few weeks, if altcoins are going down at a slower pace than Bitcoin or at a similar pace as Bitcoin, then you know that Bitcoin really broke the altcoin market, and now it's just a matter of time before sufficient QE comes back, and then we go back up, right? Now, I want to show you another chart, and that's the same chart, but now we're going to include Ethereum. And the way you do that is you look at total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. And when you look at this one, it's slightly different in the sense that it hasn't really come down to that same level that total 3 did. If you guys remember, total 3 came back all the way down to this level, or close to it, whereas total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, which includes ETH, is still way up here, So this metric arguably needs to go down to this level at the very least, just to get back to where it was back over here in September of 2018. Now, I am not personally convinced that this metric has to go all the way back down to this level down here. I don't necessarily think that it has to. We could make the case. I could make the case that it could, but I also think that there is a reason to think that for this metric, 58% or so, could be a significant level. The reason I say that is if you look at ETH Bitcoin, which the only difference between total 3 and total 2 is you're adding in ETH. If you look at ETH Bitcoin, it is true that it's been putting in lower highs since 2017. It's also been putting in higher lows. So for a lot of altcoins, there's a pretty clear trend of lower highs and lower lows. But for ETH, that trend isn't as clear, right? It's not as clear. And a lot of people say, well, Ben, why are you always so bearish on ETH Bitcoin? Guys, what reason was there to be bullish on it? Hell, it's just gone down for 2 years now, right? So what I'm saying is, what if ETH Bitcoin just comes back down to this trend line here? around 0.03 to 0.04. If it bottoms out there, which I think it could, then that means that total 2 minus USDT out of Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have to go back down to these lows down here. Remember, I'm not calling for 70% dominance. Have I ever said that Bitcoin's dominance is going to 70%? I mean, it could, anything's possible, but that has never been my target. What's my target? 60%. Why 60%? Well, 60% is, there's a few reasons. A lot of times when you get these, these bubbles, these alt Bitcoin bubbles, you sort of return back to where it broke down from. And you can see that it really started to break down. This big trend down started at 60%, right? This major move where it just started going on week after week after week, it started at 60%. So that's the reason why it's my target. Then later, just by happenstance, I mean, again, I haven't really been big on the fib retracement tool in the past. I've gotten a little bit more accustomed to it recently. But when you look at the fib retracement tool and you look to see, the different levels, we've already made it back up to the 0.382. I think the next stop is 0.5, which corresponds to 56% dominance, which I think will be a big milestone. And then finally, the 618. The 618 happens to be 60% dominance, precisely, right? I mean, 60% dominance, which happens to be where we broke down from, right? After it sort of slowly grinded down, and then the major breakdown occurred at 60%. I think it's going back to 618. Funny enough, if you look at where it broke down last cycle, Bitcoin dominance rallied to the 618. That's precisely where it rallied to. The 618. Last cycle, the 618 was 73%. This cycle, the 618 is 60%. So I'm not calling for dominance to necessarily go back to where it was. I'm just saying, hey, what if it goes up and goes to 60%? You can see that it put in a higher low. Perhaps it'll put in a lower high and only go up to, say, 60% or something. I don't know. I mean, look, you could always make a case that it's going to go higher than 60%, right? If you want to say that maybe it's an oscillator or something, but that's not my focus right now. My focus is I think it's going to 60%, and from that level, I'm going to be more open-minded to the Bitcoin dominance topping out. Until 60%, my bias on dominance is still higher. And yes, anytime I make this video, people are like, well, what about so-and-so says it's already topped out? They've all been saying the same thing for like 2 years now, and it just keeps on going higher. So what do I say? At what point? Yes, eventually they'll be right. Eventually the dominance will top out. But, they've been wrong for 2 years now. I mean, do you think they're going to change their mind now and say that it's, that it's not going to go up, or that it'll go up if they've been bearish on dominance for 2 years? No. Why not? Because they want their altcoins to go up. That's why. They want their altcoins to pump against Bitcoin. That's why most people are here, is to make money on alts, right? Let's not kid ourselves. Most people here want to make money on altcoins. The problem is that during certain phases, you're better off with just Bitcoin, preserving that valuation, and then going into altcoins after the dominance is likely topped. Now that sort of raises the question, well, how do you know dominance is topped? None of us do. None of us know. It's possible that it's already topped. There's people that are probably smarter than me that think it's already topped. And maybe they're right. I'm just saying, if you look at history, it took looser monetary policy for dominance to top. And so perhaps that's what it'll take this time. And because we're dealing with inflation, and because we're dealing with a very resilient U.S. economy and a labor market that has been resilient as well, what reason does the Fed have to pivot right now? And if you guys remember, do you guys remember this rally here by alts against Bitcoin? Right here. That was right around the time that the market was so convinced we were going to get a March rate cut. And then that March rate cut got priced out. And as it got priced out, alt Bitcoin pairs fell. This is not, I know we could say that one data point doesn't make a trend. And you're right, it certainly doesn't. But this trend goes beyond crypto. Again, look at the Russell divided by the NASDAQ. The low, the Russell low against the NASDAQ in November, it's now returned back to it, right? The RTY divided by NDQ, it's back to where it was in November of 2023. And it got like this on a rally by the NASDAQ, right? It was a rally by the NASDAQ that took it back up. It was a rally by the NASDAQ. Now, look at alt Bitcoin pairs. They have not yet returned to that November low. I'm saying I think they will, meaning that the altcoins could drop another 10% against Bitcoin just to get back down to the range low. And I think they're going to go below that, right? I think they're going to eventually go below that around the time of that first rate cut. One of the things that you may have noticed in this market is that we're just chasing one narrative after another. It was the merge for ETH when ETH Bitcoin's going up. It was the spot ETF, and following the spot ETF for Bitcoin, there was an immediate rotation into ETH because people were thinking about the ETH ETF and saying, all right, well, now it's time for ETH to shine. And what did I say? I said, guys, look, the ETH ETF is great and all, but there's a problem with that thesis. And the problem is twofold. First of all, we're not back in looser monetary policy. Second of all, the halving comes before the ETF. The ETF is probably not until May at the earliest, and that's assuming it gets approved, and it might not even get approved. So if we're chasing one narrative after another, I think what a lot of people did is they immediately said, all right, Bitcoin spot ETF, it's done. Let's go chase the narrative for ETH. But then the market's like, well, what if it doesn't get approved? The halving comes first, and we're still in tight monetary policy. So why should ETH Bitcoin durably go up right now? And you can see that it came right back down, right? ETH Bitcoin has simply faded right back down off of that bounce. Do you guys remember that trend line from, I mean, it feels like forever ago. This trend line over here. We were watching this trend line for a long time. This is a trend line, by the way, that a lot of people told me I was wrong on and that it would bounce off of here. If you guys remember that. You guys probably don't. It was mostly on Twitter or X, but I had so many people tell me that like this was going to break up to the upside and that it would never break down. It broke down. We actually got back into it, but this most recent wick came right up to that 21-week EMA and right up to that downtrend line, and then it got rejected off of it. So I suspect it's only a matter of time. I think that Bitcoin, when Bitcoin dominance is at 56%, I think that ETH Bitcoin has durably broken down. Why is 56% also important? Well, 56% is actually, last cycle is where, the 0.5 retracement last cycle is where Bitcoin USD found a local high, right? It's where it found a local high. And I'm not putting a ton of weight into that. I've recognized many times in the past that when Bitcoin gets into these, like, you know, these manic type phases where it just goes up and up and up, like, not to try to stand in the way and say that it can't go higher. Like, I fully admit it could go higher. I mean, it could go, you know, it could always go higher, right? I mean, there's always a reason why it could continue to go up. It's impossible to time the top. It's impossible to time it. I don't know where the top is before there's a larger drop. I know that so far, the rallies by Bitcoin, or the drawdowns by Bitcoin have been about 20%. About 20% or so. And the one we just got was no different. It was about a 20% drop. They've all been 20%. And this is why I said over here, guys, this might be all you get for a while. Doesn't mean you can't eventually go below it, but I mean, it's a 20% drop. All these other ones were 20% drops. In 2019, during QT, we also had similar types where it would only drop a few percent, right? It would only drop a few percent. By the time you got a larger drop and people were finally like, oh, finally a 30% drop, let's pile in now. It was too late. We were already in a downtrend. But what was interesting about it, if you go look at dominance, is that when we hit that 0.5 retracement level, so when we went through the 0.5, that is what marked the top for Bitcoin USD loosely, right? I mean, you can see that once we hit that 0.5 target, June 24th, that is where Bitcoin USD topped. A local top, right? I mean, we didn't go put in a new low, but it was in fact a local top right here. You see that where Bitcoin dominance went to the 0.5? That's what marked that local high on Bitcoin USD. And then after that, Bitcoin USD was stuck in traffic on Struggle Street for a little bit, as the economy was, as the Fed was increasing the size of their balance sheet, but they weren't really doing enough at the time. The S&P continued to climb higher, right? The S&P loved looser monetary policy. Altcoins loved looser monetary policy with respect to Bitcoin, but unfortunately, because Bitcoin was then in a downtrend, alt USD pairs went down, right? So even though alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed out, alt USD pairs then went down. So this is why I talk about, managing risk and whatnot. And, I know there's all sorts of different strategies people have. Some people are just completely, fully 100% committed, YOLO. They're calling for 300K again, and then other people are 100% cash, and they're not hedged at all. I think it makes sense to be somewhere in between, right? I mean, because, and I've said that forever. I mean, if you're 100% cash, you have no exposure to the potential upside, and it's not that the asset class can't eventually get a larger pullback. The problem is that if you have no exposure, then you run the risk of basically buying the top because you feel like you're getting left behind. So by having some exposure, you can enjoy the upside while also saying, you know what? So what if Bitcoin gets some type of flash crash at some point where it drops 50%, which happens. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but I mean, it happens. So what, right? I mean, eventually it'll probably recover and continue to go back up, because what does the Fed do? The Fed prints more money. When the Fed prints more money, that money finds a home. If you're going to be in crypto and you believe that crypto has a future, Bitcoin's got to survive. Like I mean, I'm sorry, but if Bitcoin doesn't survive, that's not a good omen for the rest of the asset class. Like, Bitcoin is what controls the market. It's not Ethereum. It's not Cardano. It's not Solana. It's not Polkadot or Chainlink or Matic or whatever. It's not any of those. If Bitcoin were not here, those altcoins, they wouldn't even exist, right? So, I know a lot of people compare Bitcoin to like AOL and MySpace and all that sort of stuff, but it's not a fair comparison. I mean, like, Bitcoin, effectively is in a class of its own. And I know that sounds, a bit like maxi talk, and I get that, but I think it really does make a lot of sense to sort of separate out your portfolio. If you're going to expand into altcoins, say, okay, you have your Bitcoin portfolio, and then you have your everything else portfolio. And if you look closely, for long periods of time, your altcoin portfolio will bleed against your Bitcoin portfolio if you never take profits in the altcoins. Okay? And we can look at a few examples, right? I mean, there's definitely a lot of examples we could look at. I do like to pick on ADA, mainly because, this is one I've talked about many times. And I also think it's a really great altcoin for just observing the cycles, right? Like, it's one of the few altcoins that actually put in a new all-time high 2 cycles in a row. Most altcoins don't do that. A few do, most don't. So ADA put in a new high on its USD pair 2 cycles in a row, and you can see it also, carved out a pretty nice bottom over here at around 400 sats. But the better way to look at this is, I feel like for a lot of people, they think like, oh, well, 1160 sats, what does that even mean? Well, the way to make it mean something is you go take the inverse of it, and you can pretty clearly see right here, if one Bitcoin was equivalent to 17,000 ADA. Today, one Bitcoin is equivalent to 82,000 ADA, right? So, it's been a huge difference, just an absolute enormous difference. So, imagine you had sold your Bitcoin for ADA, imagine you sold your ADA for Bitcoin in 2021. You literally could get like 4 to 5 times your ADA for that Bitcoin, right? You held on to Bitcoin throughout the entire bear market. And even in throughout all of 2023, you rode it up, you rode it down. Bitcoin's effectively the same price as it was near the beginning of 2022, but your purchasing power to buy ADA has gone up 5x, 4 to 5x. And all you did was hold Bitcoin during QT and during high interest rates. That's all you did. You didn't try to time the market beyond just saying, hey, we're going into a QT, higher interest rates, where the Fed's going to crack down for a while to solve this inflation issue. Just sit in Bitcoin, ride it out, right? Ride it out. And no matter where Bitcoin ends up, you're likely going to be able to buy that altcoin for a lot more of that altcoin for the same amount of Bitcoin. Same thing for all these other alts, right? Bitcoin, Same thing. You know, take the inverse of it. Back over here. 1 Bitcoin would have gotten you 1,100 DOT. Today, 1 Bitcoin gets you 6,500 DOT. All you had to do is sit in Bitcoin for the last couple of years. You didn't have to predict where the market was going to go. You didn't. You didn't care about that. You just said, hey, I don't know where the market's going to go. I'm just going to sit in Bitcoin until we get back to looser monetary policy. I don't know when we're going to get back to looser monetary policy. That's the great thing about it. It doesn't matter. Until we do, all Bitcoin pairs likely go down. A lot of times after I make these videos, at some point in the next week or two, altcoins will get some form of a pump against Bitcoin. And they'll be like, well, you said, guys, look at ETH Bitcoin. I mean, yes, it's had some pretty great pumps, but like, who's been on the wrong side of the market, right? The person that has been bearish on ETH Bitcoin or the person who's bullish on it? I mean, even if you look at it on, say, like a longer time frame, I mean, it kind of looks like it held support throughout this entire phase, and then here it broke down, and then it just back tested it a couple times, and it just can't get back above it. And what, again, it likely just continues to bleed, and then eventually it breaks down. Maybe it breaks down in March. Maybe it breaks down in May. I don't know. Probably is going to correspond to whenever the first rate cut comes. So could be sooner, could be later. I don't know. But I can tell you, I'm not that interested in ETH until it breaks the range low. And I get that's somewhat deterministic. If you want to be more risky, then you could always have ETH in your portfolio. And again, if you're going to expand beyond Bitcoin, I personally think, not financial advice, I personally think Ethereum is the second best option, right? I think it is the second best. But even in that case, if you have ETH, I mean, you have to be aware that it's still in a downtrend against Bitcoin, and that hasn't yet been proven otherwise. It really hasn't. You can also look at ETH Bitcoin and compare it to net liquidity. We did a video on this recently, and you can pretty clearly see like that it really is a function of net liquidity, right? Like net liquidity, is putting in these lower lows. So is ETH Bitcoin, right? I mean, you can see that like this bounce here in net liquidity kind of corresponds to this bounce by ETH Bitcoin. I mean, it's pretty clear, right? And if net liquidity continues to go down, which the central banks around the world, while some are expanding them like China, most are still reducing the size of their balance sheet. And you could also argue that the dollar, if you look at the dollar, if the dollar goes back up, that's going to make liquidity go down because all these, all the balance sheets are being converted to US dollars when we add them up. And it looks like the dollar could be going back up. It kind of looks like the Bitcoin dominance chart to some degree. I've talked about this a few times. Right? A high, a lower high, a low, a lower low. Right? Same thing, right? A high, a lower high, a low, and then a lower low. Then going back to Bitcoin dominance, right? And then a lower low, and then a higher high. DXY, a lower low, and then a higher high. Bitcoin dominance, double bottom, rejection off the bull market support band right here, and then back up. DXY, we got one low. I don't know if it's going to go back down. Honestly, I don't know. I don't really care. If you look at the bull market support band, though, it's right at the 20-week SMA. So if it gets rejected here off the 20-week SMA and goes back down, then I would look for a potential double bottom or a slightly higher low, and then maybe it blasts off, or maybe it doesn't need to make that move and it just keeps going higher. If you were to look at the euro, again, Euro USD, you can see that it kind of already had sort of a double bounce, right? It went up to back up to the trend line, got rejected, came back up to it again, got rejected. Now it's back below the 20-week moving average. One way to look at the dollar is to, you can look at it like this, but you could also look at the inverse of it. Right? Sort of these potential distribution. And this is potentially just a potentially just back testing it, right? You have, you put in a low, a higher low, a higher low. You break it, and then you just go back up and back test it. Maybe that's all it's doing. And if the dollar goes up, that means inverse dollar goes down. And if inverse dollar goes down, that means net liquidity goes down. And if net liquidity goes down, it would implies that ETH Bitcoin breaks down. And if ETH Bitcoin breaks down, it likely means Bitcoin dominance goes up. And if Bitcoin dominance goes up, the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio is best preserved by being Bitcoin heavy, as opposed to altcoin heavy. You can also look at Bitcoin dominance plus Ethereum dominance, which I think is kind of interesting to look at. When you look at it like this, you know, you can kind of see like last cycle, Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance actually had a local top here at 73% right there, just like it did right here, up to 73%. And then it came down here to 67, 68%, which is exactly where it just came down to. And then after going to 67, 68%, it then blasted through these milestones and went all the way back up here. Some people say, well, you know, all the stablecoin market's going to make it so the Bitcoin dominance can't go up. Guys, I'm not calling for 70%. Again, I'm calling for 60, which is 13% below the last cycle's high of 73. You could also look at Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance and see that it's in the same exact phase where it was late business cycle in 2019, right? I mean, like, look at where it is right here. The same spot that it was in April, May of 2019, just before Bitcoin got that final pop up and finally broke alt Bitcoin pairs down. That final move, and it finally broke alt Bitcoin pairs down. Right here in June, 1 month before the first rate cut. So I think it's only a matter of time before it does the same thing. This is Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. So get the stablecoin dominance stuff out of here, because this includes it. Then maybe it breaks up, and then it potentially goes all the way back up. You could also include USDC dominance. I even drew it out, right? I previously drew it out. It looks like it's following it so far, right? You can see it right here. Bounced right off the low right there. Same spot, in fact, that it bounced off of in May of 2019. Right before Bitcoin got that final push, dominance broke up. Dominance hit the 0.5 retracement, which this cycle would be 56%. That's where it found a local low right here. This USDC dominance plus USDT dominance plus Bitcoin dominance found a low at 58%, then broke through this. And look, it even wicked, look, local high right there at the same level, 64%, then down to 58, and then break back up. And then it went all the way up to 75%. Imagine if it went up to 75%. And this one, you can't say, well, what about this? This includes the two of the largest stablecoins, USDT and USDC. So it includes it. So in this case, maybe it is an oscillator because it includes the stablecoin market. We could also go look at and this is the biggest, one of the biggest cases to be made for dominance not being as strong is to go look at sort of year-to-date performance in halving years. This is probably the thing that gives me the biggest pause. If you look at say like 2012, 2012 there weren't really a lot of altcoins. 2016 and 2020, you can see that dominance didn't really go up that much. I mean, it went like maybe a few percent above the yearly open, but also we were in loose monetary policy at the time. There's a big debate going on right now. It's like, what's Bitcoin following? Is it following monetary policy? Is it following sort of the same cycles? You could argue it's sort of doing both. I mean, maybe it's still doing both. I could certainly see ways that both theories end up panning out, because normally it's in an election year where we go back to looser monetary policy. Historically, it has been, and it seems like it's going to be again. So, but if you overlay 2024 onto here, you can see that dominance, excluding stables, is doing something that it hasn't really done. I mean, normally it just sort of falls off a cliff. This time, it started to fall off a cliff, and then it said, just kidding. Everyone YOLO'd back into alts because they thought dominance train was over, but what if it's not? What if the dominance rally is not over, and it just keeps on going higher because we have not yet shifted to looser monetary policy? So that's where we are. And that stuff has happened before. I mean, like, if you go look at ETH Bitcoin, right? Go look at ETH Bitcoin. Sometimes seasonality doesn't play out. Look at 2018 ETH Bitcoin, and then look at 2022 ETH Bitcoin. The merge potentially helped ETH Bitcoin stay flat in 2022. But then in 2023, it went down. And so far in 2024, it's still at relatively flat. But if you compare, say, 2020 to 2024 and 2016, you can see that at this point in the year, ETH Bitcoin is underperforming both prior halving years, Bitcoin halving years, both of them. It's underperforming them at this point. And we'll see if it changes, but so far it is not. So, I mean, that's essentially where we are. I think I've made my case probably about 36 times on Bitcoin dominance over the last couple of years, and it's been a long journey, for sure. I hope that these videos have been useful to some people. I think they have. It's nice seeing the positive feedback occasionally. A lot of times, the dominance videos just make a mockery of myself on Twitter. But I think it has worked out. I think that, the dominance rally is still intact. Yes, there's some trend lines we got to break through, right? I'm not gonna try to sugarcoat it and say it's a sure thing. There's some trend lines here potentially that the dominance has got to break through to sort of solidify it. You could also look at it as potentially a sort of an ascending triangle. Let's look at it on the weekly. And then just look at the line chart. Maybe we look at it like this and say it's in some form of ascending triangle. And if that's the case, it's only a matter of time before it, breaks out to the upside. So there's a lot to consider. Another thing too is, in order to figure out if ETH Bitcoin is going to break down, alt Bitcoin pairs will probably break down first, is my guess. Because that's what happened last cycle. Last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs broke down a couple of weeks before ETH Bitcoin did. Because alt Bitcoin pairs collectively broke down the week of June 24th. Right here, the week of June 24th. But ETH Bitcoin did not break down until the week of July 8th. So it took 2 weeks. So if you're looking at some of these other alts, like Matic Bitcoin is a good example. And it's been sort of loosely, tied with ETH to some degree. I mean, this is one that, this was just sort of a massive distribution up here, and it's getting squeezed now, right? It's getting squeezed at the range low and between the bull market support band. And there's a chance it breaks up, right? There's a chance that it does. But if it doesn't, if it breaks down, then it would likely be a bad omen for ETH and implies that ETH Bitcoin could break down. Some of these alts have already broken down. If you look at Aave Bitcoin, it broke down long ago. I mean, like the June low, the June 2022 low for Aave Bitcoin was way up here, right? It broke that long ago. And now it's starting to take out potentially the June 2023 low, right? I mean, you see, you give it long enough and they just keep breaking down, right? I mean, I know it's not popular. When I first joined crypto, I recognized some of these trends. I think I remember hearing some people talk about how a lot of altcoins would just break down against Bitcoin, and I didn't want to hear it. I was like, no, you don't know. My altcoin's special. You're not gonna convince me. And you give it enough time, and so many of these altcoins, they just become bleeders. You might not believe me now, but when you look at relics from prior cycles, that's what they become. Look at Dash Bitcoin. It just never stops bleeding, right? Yeah, occasionally it pumps some, but it's been going down since March 2017 with a few pumps in between. Even Monero. I have no problem against Monero. I used to have some. But how do I hold an asset that just keeps on bleeding against Bitcoin? What am I supposed to do? And last year, 2022, in 2022, so many people were telling me, hey, what about XMR BTC? What about it? I mean, so what? It rallied for a little while. Now it's just putting in new lows, right? That it hasn't, XMR BTC hasn't gone this low since August of 2016. I know you think that you know it's not your altcoin, but I'm telling you, 99% of altcoins, this is what the chart will eventually look like against Bitcoin. And the altcoins that are responsible for the next altcoin bubble against Bitcoin. So like, let's just fast forward in time and assume that, you know, we eventually break down, we spend some time down here, and then eventually it breaks back up. The altcoins that are responsible for the next alt Bitcoin bubble, most of them are probably going to be new that didn't even exist in 2021. And there will be some that will probably put in new highs that existed in the last cycle. There will likely be some. And the way to sort of figure those out is to see which ones are holding their lows on their Bitcoin pair. Guys, I didn't want to see it when I first joined crypto, but that is the trend, right? Like, that is the trend. It's clear that it has been the trend. We can say this time is different, but what if it's not? What if it's really not? You know, I mean, that's where I stand. Others Bitcoin. Some people say, well, how come you never look at others? Others Bitcoin. It's been better than total 3 divided by Bitcoin. I'll give you that. Others divided by Bitcoin has been better than total 3. I think others just doesn't include the top 10, I believe. So it includes everything below that. Some more of them getting into sort of the micro cap stuff. You might say, well, Ben, others Bitcoin pumped 65% since June of 2023. It did over here too, right? Same type of move. It topped out in March 2019, 4 months before the first rate cut. This top here, January. 4 months after January is May. Perhaps that's when the first rate cut occurs, in May. The one nice thing about others Bitcoin is that it's not clearly in a downtrend, right? So this is your bullish case long-term for all Bitcoin pairs, is that, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be a bleeder. Maybe not. Maybe it's an oscillator. But I'm saying it's, in the best case scenario, it's an oscillator. In the best case, right? So this would be my best case scenario for altcoins. Worst case scenario would be something like that, right? Where it's just, you know, they're just macro bleeding against Bitcoin. So that's your worst case. And I feel like this is your best case. It's an oscillator. The degen case would be something like, you know, trying to look at these lows here or something and saying that it'll hold. And maybe it will, guys. I mean, like, I'm trying to be open-minded about it. I mean, if it falls back in and it can't break these lows and we get back to looser monetary policy, as I said, I'll probably pivot my view and be like, all right, well, we tried, and they didn't break down. I think they will break down because I think we're still, you know, a few months probably from rate cuts, and last cycle they didn't bottom out until 2 months after rate cuts. So I don't know how they're going to hold these lows for, you know, for the next half year. I mean, again, every time they get pumped up, it's the elevator up and the stairs down. I mean, everyone gets so excited when they pump, and then they just slowly bleed back down. I mean, you can kind of feel like the, you know, people losing interest. And it's like, why? Bitcoin is up. Like, why are people losing interest? Shouldn't more people be here looking at crypto? They're not. Look at the social risk. It's at 0.124, right? Where is everyone? They're not here. Why not? Because most people don't care about Bitcoin. They care about their altcoins. Where did social risk finally start to trend up last cycle? It put in a low in late 2018, and then it put in a higher low in September of 2019 when the Fed shifted to looser monetary policy. That's what brought people back. Cheaper money, right? And we're just not there yet. You can see the social risk going down. You might, what's the social risk? Well, look at, and again, it's not just my channel. You might say, well, Ben, no one cares about your boring stuff. It's not just my channel, right? I mean, it's all these channels. All these channels. Look at this. Even this rally, the 30-day SMA of YouTube views to all these YouTube channels was still a lower high compared to August of 2023, right? These are all lower highs. People are still leaving despite the fact that prices are going up. So it's more than just price that brings people to crypto, right? It's more than just price. It's also monetary policy. You know, if so many people are worried about, you know, rent, and I mean, I know a lot of people watching this video, you know, you're a lot of people are probably doing fine in life, right? And you got a lot of spare money to sort of throw around, right? Otherwise, you're probably not spending an hour watching a Bitcoin dominance video, okay? But a lot of people, you know, they're just not coming back yet. And I guess looser monetary policy will bring them back, but I don't know. We'll see. It's not just based on this. It's also based on some other metrics. YouTube subscribers had a little bit of a pop recently, but it kind of seems like it's trending back down. It's also based on Twitter followers to various analysts on Twitter. Got a little bit of a pop recently, but it kind of just has gone back down. Exchanges, a big pop recently, actually. A lot of it is advertising too, but that too is also putting in lower highs in the face of rising prices. Twitter followers to layer ones. Some renewed interest recently, right? Some. Again, I'm not saying that, like, you know, you have to look at this and sit on your hands. I've said for 2 years my crypto portfolio is just Bitcoin heavy, because I know that as people leave the Cryptoverse, Bitcoin dominance goes up, because all those bids to sort of buy the dip on altcoins, they're just not, there's not as many of them. And so the altcoins, they just can't keep pace with Bitcoin. It doesn't mean they can't go up. I'm not trying to say they can't go up. If Bitcoin goes up, it can lift the altcoin market with it. I mean, look at Total 3. It's well off the low, right? It's all the way up here. It's well off the low. If Bitcoin goes up, it can take the altcoin market with it. But that's not the point. It never was. The point was that, like, you know, if you're gonna buy Bitcoin, or if you're gonna buy a crypto, the only way the altcoin market goes up during QT, late business cycles, if Bitcoin went up first. Bitcoin doesn't go up, the altcoin market probably not going to go up. And if the altcoin market only goes up because Bitcoin goes up, then why not just have Bitcoin? Right? That's the argument, right? That's been the argument for a long time. I mean, I get that some altcoins have gone up some recently. Look at ADA. You know, it's at 53 cents. Whoop-de-doo, right? It's back to where it was in September of 2022. In September of 2022, Bitcoin was at 20K. It's at 46K now, right? Like it's 2.5 times almost that price. ADA's at the same price it was. Total 3, the same level that it was back in May at the collapse in May of 2022. Bitcoin, it's where it was in March of 2022. And the issue is that if Bitcoin at some point gets a correction, right? I know it's impossible to imagine that right now. But if it does get a correction, you know, in 2024, it can afford to give back a lot and still be well above these prior levels. Whereas the altcoin market doesn't have that same luxury, right? Like, it's not that far off the low. I'm not saying that it has to take out the low, but you can see, like, why Bitcoin has been safer. Is because, like, if Bitcoin corrects, then well, to hell with the altcoin market. As long as Bitcoin goes up, yeah, the altcoin market will sort of chase it. But why not just be in Bitcoin over altcoins? I mean, the Bitcoin risk right now is relatively high. So, I mean, that's sort of one issue with getting into Bitcoin. At these levels, like the risk is getting pretty elevated. So I'm not trying to imply that it's like, risk free or anything like that. In fact, I think the while I mean it's possible Bitcoin could go higher, it's also true that the risk on Bitcoin is pretty high right now. I mean it's in the 0.5 to 0.6 risk band, right? So it's a little bit, and it's already gone to the 0.6, 0.7 risk band. So it's basically the same kind of level that it was here in 2019. So there's the same level. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that bought in 2019 and they watched Bitcoin drop, and it still went up eventually, right? So, but I mean, the risk is somewhat elevated. Personally, I buy Bitcoin below 0.4 risk. Right now it's at 0.58 risk, so I buy it below 0.4 risk. I had several limit orders filled in late 2022 that were all published on ITC Premium. Yes, I could have bought more. I could have YOLO'd all my cash in. I didn't. I'm more risk averse, right? Like I want to buy some in case it goes up, but I want to preserve some of my capital to hopefully take advantage of some sweet deals that can occasionally present themselves, right? We never know when larger drawdowns are going to happen, but they do sometimes happen, right? I mean, they do sometimes occur, and it's hard to know when they're going to occur, but they do happen. And when they do, it's worthwhile to have some cash to be ready for them, right? There's a reason, it's not always a good idea to just be 100% in. I mean, it all sounds good when the market is going up. At one point, you wake up and the market's down 40%. It's nice to have some cash. And even the most bullish people will admit that there will be drops eventually, right? So far, we've just seen 20% drops. So I mean, it'll be interesting to see if and when Bitcoin dominance hits that 0.5 retracement, if that corresponds to a important level for Bitcoin USD or not, or if Bitcoin USD just continues to defy everything and go up. I don't know. My guess is that Bitcoin will just continue to chop around and chop the altcoin market up for a while longer. We still have the halving in April. And so that narrative, I imagine, will still be sort of the strongest narrative over the ETH ETF narrative. Maybe from April to May, people then go back to the whole ETH narrative. In fact, I mean, if you look at ETH Bitcoin, I don't know when it's going to break down or if, but I do think it will. But if you look at it, you can see last cycle it bounced here in the month of December, and then it got another bounce in May, right? So it had one bounce here in December and then another bounce in May. This bounce here occurred in January. I don't know if it's going to bounce again or if it'll just go through. Probably depends on how strong Bitcoin stays, but if ETH Bitcoin doesn't break down before May, then you could see another little pop like that, and then it break down, right? But if that happens, then it might imply that the first rate cut doesn't come until June, right? So we will see. We will see. I think I've probably gone on long enough. I don't know what else to talk about. I feel like I've spoken mostly about, just everything I could really think of. We'll see if it breaks out. The highest weekly close on Bitcoin dominance is this cycle is 54.09. I mean, it's already at 50. I mean, it's less than 1%. It's less than 1% just to get to a new weekly close high. It'd have to go all the way up to 55.26 is where it went in December. It actually went higher on this wick, but because it only did it in like an hourly wick, it doesn't even show it on TradingView. If you go to like a minute candle or an hourly candle, you can actually see it went up to 55.33% in the beginning of January. So really, it needs to go up, 2% from here, like 55.33% would be a new high. Doesn't mean it's going to go straight there. We could go up, get rejected off the trend line, go back down. And you can pretty clearly see, right, like this double bottom here on Bitcoin dominance is, look, you can see it total 2 minus USDT out of Bitcoin, right? It's the same thing, like it's just a double top. And you can see it's just got rejected off the 20-week SMA. This one, total 3, already below the 20-week SMA. Total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, already below the 20-week. And you can even connect the dots and see that it looks like it's breaking down. Total 2, which includes ETH, has not yet broken down on that trend line. So first it has to break that trend line, then it has to go all the way back down to the range low, then it has to get a weekly close below the range low. And then once all that happens, then I think Bitcoin has finally accomplished its goal of breaking all Bitcoin pairs down. It's been a long journey. The journey will likely continue for a little bit longer. We'll be on the lookout for, once Bitcoin dominance enters into that final phase, I think it'll be important. I'll try to be open-minded. If Bitcoin dominance does not break out between now and looser monetary policy's arrival, then I'll try to stay open-minded. Until then, I will keep my bias that dominance will continue higher until proven otherwise. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Link is in the description below. We have a website with hundreds, if not thousands of charts, not only on crypto, but also on stocks and macro stuff. Make sure you guys check that out. Again, link is in the description below. You can keep that rate as long as you not cancel. See you guys next time. Bye.